Hello and welcome to the WEBCON BPS tutorial for data sources. In this video, I will attempt to introduce some of the main data sources that can be used by the WEBCON BPS system and how to configure them. So first of all, go over to the Data Sources tab of Designer Studio. I don't think we've ever been here in any of the previous tutorials, so now is a good time to say a few words about this section. So you will notice on the list on the left-hand side that it is divided into two parts: connections and data sources. Connections are basically the connection strings. They are basically the connection parameters to SQL, Oracle, and web service data sources. In previous versions, the connection string would be configured directly in the data source configuration, but you would end up with a lot of data sources with the same connection string, and if something changed, you would have to modify it in every single data source configuration. So now, for convenience, the connection string and the data source proper is configured separately. This also allows for a little bit of role separation, so you can have one person that is responsible for configuring all the connections, so like a database administrator, and then you have all your BPS Designer Studio power users that will just configure data sources for use in your processes. And of course, you can have as many data sources using one connection as necessary. You can check which data sources are using the current connection by clicking the connection usage. Okay, so let's start off with the most basic data source, the fixed values list. As the name implies, it allows you to manually define a list of values which can then be used, for example, in a choice field. So here is an example. I've quickly written up a bunch of currency codes. And as the ID, I used the country name, and as a description, I used the currency name. Okay, now let's go see this data source in practice. Let's go over to the Processes tab. For this example, I'm just going to use the gift approval process that we created previously in the previous parts of the tutorial. So I've created this choice field, and I've set the currency codes fixed value list as its data source. I've also had to make it visible on the form using the field matrix, but this was covered in the first tutorial, so I will not go over it now. As for the configuration of the form field itself, I've set its behavior to autocomplete. And in the advanced configuration, the thing that should be noted here is that its name column, so for me it's the currency code, has the type name. What this means is that on the form this will be shown in bold. I will demonstrate this in just a moment. And I also have my two other columns, the ID column, which in my case is the country, and the description, which in my case is the currency name. I've also set it so that you can search by any of the three columns. So for example, if I begin typing the country name or the currency code, it will still show me what I'm looking for. Okay, so let's take a look at SharePoint. So let's go over to SharePoint. Start a new workflow instance, and here are my demonstration form fields. So let's go to the fixed value list, and as you can see here, the currency code, which in my case is the name type column, is shown in bold, and the two other columns are also visible here. And since in the fixed value list they have quite awkward names, it's ID, name, and description, you can rename them to display as anything you want. So in my case, the ID is called country and the description is called currency name. And since I set it so that you can search by any of the three columns, so I can begin to type, for example, the currency code, and I will have suggestions, but I can also begin to type the country, and it will also suggest matching values by country. Okay, moving on, let's do another easy one, this time a SharePoint list. So you create a SharePoint list directly on your site, and then in this configuration you can find it by entering the site collection, and then use this picker to find the site name, and finally use the last picker to find the list name. So in this case, I have this employee list, SharePoint list, which I created. Let's go and check it out. The main advantage of a SharePoint list is that it can be edited by certain end users with appropriate permissions directly from their SharePoint site without any backend shenanigans. So in this example, the idea I had was a faculty member list where professors can add their name, consultation hours, and office number to the list, and of course modify it as necessary. So those are the three columns that I created. Now let's go back to Designer Studio and test this data source to see what we get back. So as you can see, apart from the three columns, there is also a bunch of metadata, like for example the ID and creation date. These of course can be ignored from the configuration of the choice field. Speaking of which, The choice field that I've made to demonstrate the Sharepoint list is pretty much identical. The behavior is set to autocomplete, and of course the data source is set to the faculty members Sharepoint list. In the advanced configuration, I've chosen to ignore all this additional data like the ID and creation date. I've only left the 3 columns that I've created, and I've set the name column, which contains the name of the professor, as the name type, so this will be displayed in bold. So let's go to Sharepoint and see what this looks like. So here is my choice field on the form, and if we click the drop down, we can see that the professor name is displayed in bold as intended, and then there are the 2 other columns displayed as complementary information. Now let's move on to something much more complex. Let's talk about BPS Internal View. This data source allows you to use all your BPS processes as data sources, essentially making all your workflow instances into data records. So this is a new feature, but something similar was possible in previous versions by simply firing SQL queries at the main BPS database to fetch whatever you needed from it. However, for somebody that is not proficient in SQL, the BPS Internal View is a much more elegant and user-friendly way of digging through your process database. If you click on the Fill Configuration button, you will notice that the configuration window looks almost identical to a Show Workflow Element web part configuration. This is intentional and makes configuring a BPS Internal View data source very intuitive. There is an article and video which cover the Show Workflow Elements web part pretty extensively. I will link them in the description below. So in this video, to keep it brief, I will only go over the basic configuration features. So first of all, you select the process which you want to use as your data source. You can also narrow down the instances that will be available to certain form types, workflows, and steps. Since my gift approval process, which I'm going to be using as the example, is pretty small, I'm just going to take all the data. Okay, and let's skip the filters and let's go straight to the most important tab, which is data selection. Here are all the columns that can be returned by your data source. I've selected most of my form fields and some relevant system fields, like for example who it was created by and which step the instance is currently in. I've also created this custom calculated column. You can add one by scrolling to the bottom and then click Add Calculated Column. I will show you what it looks like underneath. So the idea here is to have a column named Link to Instance, which will display the instance number, but this instance number will not be just plain text. If you click it, it will be a link and it will take you over to the form of the relevant instance. Alright, so let's do a demonstration. This time, instead of a normal choice field, I'll be using a data table form field. I've set the data source to my BPS Internal View data source. In the advanced configuration, you can select which of the columns will be displayed on this form field. I've decided to ignore some of the system fields, like for example created and ID, and instead of the normal instance number column, I'll be using my special link to instance column. Up until this point in the demonstration, I've had the load on demand option turned on. I'm going to turn it off right now. Basically, this option kept this form field hidden in the previous demonstrations. Alright, so here is our data table form field. It contains the columns that we defined, including the instance number column, which contains links to the specific workflow instances. In its current state, this data table displays the entire data source, that is every single workflow instance registered for this process. Next, we'll try narrowing down the results a little bit. Okay, so for the first example, imagine that you are reviewing a request for a recipient, let's imagine John Doe, and in your data table, to help you make your decision, you want to view all other workflow instances that have also been registered for John Doe as the recipient. In other words, you want to display only the rows whose recipient column matches your recipient form field. Okay, we're back in Designer Studio in the configuration for the data table form field. On your right hand side, you will have this filter field. Click on it to open up the editor. To edit your filter, you can either drag the elements from the right hand side, or you can just type directly into the work area. So in our case, we want to make a comparison, and we want to compare the recipient form field to the recipient data source column. But you have to remember that the recipient data source column returns only the name, first name, last name, while the recipient form field is a choice field, so it can return the data in various formats. Like in the default, it's login and name, so we have to change this to only the name. And this way, it will make a valid comparison between the name returned by the recipient form field and the name found in the recipient data source column. Okay, let's click OK and save the process. And hopefully this first row, which has a different recipient, should disappear. There we go. Alright, excellent. Let's add another filter onto this one. So now imagine that you are viewing your data table with all other workflow instances for the same recipient, but you want to exclude the one that you are currently viewing. Alright, so let's drag an AND logic operation onto this existing filter. And let's switch it into vertical layout. And we want to add another comparison, but this time different than. So we want to compare our instance number of our current workflow instance to the instance number from the data source column. And now hopefully when we hit save and go back to SharePoint, if we select any of these workflow instances, we'll be able to see all of them except the one we are currently viewing. So let's go for this one with the title delegation. And here it is, title, and the data table contains all other workflow instances for the same recipient except the one which we are currently viewing. This particular method of defining filters is practical because you only need to create one data source definition which returns the columns that you need, and then you can keep reusing it across multiple form fields. And even though each of these form fields can have different filters and different advanced configurations with different columns selected, they still share one data source. Okay, so that covers BPS Internal View and internal data sources as a whole. Now let's move on to external data sources in WEBCON BPS. These include Microsoft SQL databases, Oracle databases, SOAP web services, and REST web services. In this video, we'll do one of each, one database and one web service. And let's start with a SQL database. So first of all, you're going to need to define a connection, which is essentially the connection string to your database. Once you've done that, you can move on to actually configuring the data source. So here's a SQL database configuration that uses the connection that we just defined. This SQL query field on the right is used for entering a select statement, which will get you the data you need. You can use this editor to help with more advanced queries. In my example, I'm simply going to load the entire table, and let's hit test to see if it works. And this means that this data source is correctly configured, and we can go ahead and use it in a form field. Okay, so back in our process, once again, we'll be using a choice field. So make sure that the data source of this form field is set to the one that we just configured, the SQL one. And let's go over to the advanced configuration. If this area is empty for you, just click read to load all your columns. Now I was lazy and I grabbed the entire table, so now is a good time to disable any of the columns that you do not want. Once you've selected the columns that you do want, remember that the column that has the name type designation will be shown in bold on the form. This data source has separate first name and last name columns, so if I've selected the first name to be shown in bold. Just to quickly demo what this looks like on the form. The first name is shown in bold, and the three other columns are shown below it. And of course, you can also configure filters. In this example here, I've made these two. The first one will show only rows where the earnings exceed 150,000, and the second one will show only rows where the date of birth is earlier than 1991. And a quick test should verify that this is true. As you can see, the number of rows is much smaller, and all the earnings exceed 150,000, and the date of birth, only those born before 1991, are displayed. Okay, so what we have now is that your data from your SQL database goes through two stages of filtering before it arrives in your form field. The first stage is on the data source definition. You have your SQL query. So in this case, I've just narrowed it down to this one table. And then on each form field, you can define some filters. This system works very well because it significantly limits the number of individual data source configurations that you need to define. Furthermore, since the connection string is configured separately, you do not have to edit it in every single data source configuration every time it changes. For all intents and purposes, this is the recommended method of handling your databases. However, if such a need should arise, it is possible to skip database definition and skip form field filters and just use SQL to query your database directly. If you go back to your form field configuration, you will notice it is possible to select a connection as the data source. What this will do is it will reset the filter area and allow you to type SQL into this field, and using this query you can get whatever you need from your database directly. This method may be not recommended, but is always an option. Okay, that covers SQL databases, and since Oracle databases are analogous to them, we can skip them, and as our last data source, let's do a web service. For demonstration purposes, I've prepared a REST web service. Again, you start by configuring connection parameters, and once you have those, you can go and configure the data source proper. On the first configuration card, you can enter some basic stuff like enter a specific URL suffix or select a different HTTP method, and then on the response card, you can select which collections you want from your result. If this is empty for you, just click load, and I only have this one collection with 2 columns, so I'm just going to select that. And back in the process configuration, I have yet another choice field, this time using the web service, the REST web service, as the data source. In the advanced configuration, unfortunately, I only have 2 columns, one with the name and one with the surname. So one of them will have to be the ID column and the other will be the name column, which will be in bold. And hopefully a quick test will show us that everything is in order. As we can see, it seems to work. And of course, you can apply filters to your web service response. Unfortunately, I do not have too much to filter, but if you're using Salesforce CRM or something of that sort, then your results will be much more interesting. Alright, and that concludes our video on WEBCON BPS data sources. As you can see, there is quite the variety of both internal and external data sources that you can use. Databases in WEBCON BPS is a gigantic topic, and there is no chance we could cover it all in one video, but we still managed to cover all the essentials, so that's good. I hope you learned something interesting, and as always, thanks for watching and goodbye.